I'm just gonna say it right up front. This episode finally gave us an answer to one of the biggest mysteries in all of Star Trek. How did Voyager have so many dang shuttles? Hello interwebs, I hope you're doing well, because we are here to talk about Star Trek Prodigy Episode 2, or technically 3, because Episode 1 was technically Episode 1 and 2, so this is technically the third, but this is also the second one that we're watching. Whatever. It's technically the second or third Star Trek Prodigy episode. I mean, what's a Star Trek show without inconsistent, like, numbering sequences of episodes? It's a true Star Trek show in true Star Trek spirit. But regardless, we're going to talk about Episode 3, Starstruck. As per usual, we're going to stay spoiler-free for just a little bit up front as I give my general thoughts on the episode, and then we'll get full on into spoilers in just a second. But spoiler-free, this episode had kind of a lot to do after the premiere. The premiere was very much about setting up the stakes, the world building, and groundwork for everything that we were going into with the show and sending our characters off on an adventure, but we didn't really get a sense of what the show was actually going to be episode to episode going forward. And also, on top of that, the premiere episode, while it did establish a lot of our characters and villains for the show, it didn't really give us a lot in terms of the dynamics between the characters and what their sort of relationships with each other are going to be. And so this episode kind of had to do all of that work, show us what a, standard episode of the show is going to be, introduce us to how these characters are going to interact with each other, and then also continue off the story of the premiere of they're on the run. What are they going to do? How are they going to get out of this situation, and what's the sort of stakes going forward? And I think in pretty much almost all of those aspects, this nailed it. This episode really made me feel a lot of the dynamics between these different characters going forward and how they're all going to fit within this crew. I think specifically the biggest characters that we got a lot out of are Rok-Tahk, Gwen, and Dal. Really got kind of the biggest highlight here in fleshing out where they're going to be sitting within the series. And honestly, also too, there was some really great heartbreaking is the wrong word, but moments that hit me in the gut that really made me feel for a lot of these characters. I think in particular, Rok-Tahk, I think, is quickly becoming like the star character of the show. I think she had some really great moments and really heartfelt moments throughout all of this, and I was very, very pleased to see that. On top of that, there was also some really fun, interesting action going on here. The final action set piece of the episode was incredibly clever, and we'll talk about it in the spoiler-filled section. And on top of all of that, this episode in particular really felt like it was doing the groundwork for kids that may be watching the show to start to understand what Star Trek is through the character of Hologram Janeway, which, by the way, hearing Kate Mulgrew back as Janeway was... I was gonna do like a chef's kiss, but I didn't kiss, so I did like a sound when I did that. So I don't know what that was, but regardless, Kate Mulgrew back as Janeway was wonderful. I have a little bit of issue with how the Hologram Janeway was presented here that I'll talk a little bit more in spoilers, because she does seem to be selectively intelligent in certain aspects, which is kind of weird for Janeway, but it works and it doesn't work to some degree for me. But on the whole, it was just really nice to see her here, and really nice to see some of these characters sort of figuring things out and figuring out the like series dynamic going forward. So on the whole, I was really pleased with this episode. It didn't knock my socks off in terms of like, oh, this episode was so amazing and wonderful, but I felt like in terms of everything that it needed to establish and do, it did, and did so effectively, and also gave us some cool action sequences and some really heartfelt moments on top of that. So I was very, very pleased with this episode. If it didn't necessarily have that garnish of like, oh yeah, I'm so excited about it, it still felt like a very solid episode that executed everything that it had to do. But we can't talk about that until we get more into spoilers, so let's get into spoilers here. So if you haven't seen the episode, come back in just a little bit and we'll talk about it. However, before we get much further, it's time to quick talk about my sponsor for the rest of my Star Trek reviews this year, The Geek Fight. The Geek Fight is a non-profit online store that fights for a diverse future, and they have two goals. Number one, create an easy way to learn about human rights thanks to their Lightbrary, a digital library with light content. Over there you can find the stories of people fighting for human rights like the amazing Marsha P. Johnson, learn about how we can abolish and rethink policing, and find movies that represent disabilities beyond stereotypes, and even more. And number two, they hope to raise money for social causes. They have t-shirts, pillows, prints, etc. with human rights and geek designs, combining the best of both worlds. For example, I have this adorable bag which has this wonderful little trans badger on it. It's absolutely adorable, and all the money for things like this go to organizations like the Human Rights Campaign, which is an LGBTQ organization fighting for LGBTQ rights. So please go check out the Geek Fight. It's a wonderful place. You get to get yourself cool knowledge and cool nerdy stuff, and also support really cool stuff, doing really great work. So please go check out the Geek Fight, and if you want 15% off all of your orders, use the promo code Jessie at checkout to get yourself that 15% off that I just mentioned. So thank you so much to the Geek Fight, and let's get back to the review. Alright, now that we're into spoiler territory, let's talk about all the specifics here. I really loved the opening of this episode where we sort of get Janeway giving the introduction to what the Federation is, sort of giving that speech like, seek out new life and new civilizations beat, which was really, really wonderful. I also loved the animation of the hologram that she displayed, like the art style that they used there was really cool. A little bit of fan serviciness with the like specific ships that we saw there, like we saw the Discovery, we saw the Defiant, we saw Voyager, we saw all the ships from all the leading shows, which doesn't make much sense in the context of this, but I'm sure is there to get kids being like, oh, I recognize those ships for when they go and watch other Star Trek shows. So I'm willing to let that pass in terms of the canon of it all, but I thought that I just really loved that animation. Was very, very nice. Also, Murph trying to eat the like little planet and then being disappointed when it was just a hologram was absolutely adorable. I also loved seeing Hologram Janeway's dynamic with the kids and her sort of being like, I can see that you guys need my help quite a bit, and that made sense for her. I will say there's, like I mentioned in my spoiler-free section, there's a little bit of, like, selective intelligence on the part of Hologram Janeway, because I feel like, I know that she's programmed to, like, help the crew and probably not be, like, fully sentient, and there's probably a little bit of programming that's making her not fully be aware of the situation, but it's sort of like she's aware that these kids aren't necessarily on the up and up, and yet she's not picking up that they're clearly not cadets, and it's this little bit of a tightrope that I'm like, I'm not 100% sure that I entirely buy, but then again, it could just be Hologram Janeway playing along with them in order to get them into the situation. So I'm kind of curious how they're going to kind of play that dynamic with Hologram Janeway without Hologram Janeway looking like too much like of a fool, which would seem a little bit weird going forward, but it was an interesting dynamic at the very least to see in this episode. Kate Mulgrew, by the way, as I mentioned before, she was absolutely wonderful. I also love the little beats with like Captain Janeway with the hologram getting like the coffee at one point in the episode, which was just wonderful, like little Easter eggs. Like, of course, Hologram Janeway gets coffee. Loved that. Going further, though, I really loved as the characters started to explore the rest of the ship, we get really good interactions with these characters. First up, we have like Dahl being this character who's kind of full of himself, and he wants to be the captain, he wants to be in charge, and yet he's not really thinking of the entire crew, he's only thinking of himself. And I love the little moments that came out where he's just like, this is my ship, and he says, oh, did I say us? I meant to say, or like, I totally said us. He's just like lying, and he's so used to like just thinking of himself that he isn't really thinking as the crew, and he's also kind of full of himself, so he thinks he can handle everything that he really, really can't. And so I just really like that sort of arrogant protagonist dynamic, which we don't often see in these types of kid shows. I mean, you see it in other things, but most of the kid shows, like, we have the self-effacing, like, I'm the good guy, I'm going to sacrifice myself, but I'm learning, and I'm not really good enough, but I still am, like, good at heart sort of thing. And so this arrogant dynamic into it is sort of a new flavor for a lead protagonist that I really like seeing with Dahl. Also, I really liked him being very reticent to trust the idea of the Federation. I mean, the Federation is such a crazy idea if you really look at it, like this utopian perfect future where everyone gets along and they're all going to trust us. Like, we know as Star Trek fans that, like, of course the Federation is the good guys here and they will help them out. But, you know, they don't know that. And as someone who grew up on a mining colony that was very much about, like, you couldn't understand the other workers. Everything was built up there to make you distrust everyone around you and not be able to communicate with everyone around you with a common tactic in order to, like, separate and divide and conquer tactics by the diviner there here. I think it made sense for Dahl's character that he wouldn't trust the Federation. And so I thought that was a brilliant way to sort of build out like our frustration with him watching, but also coming out of an understandable character place. Other things too is I really loved seeing the characters get to like see like how cool a Federation ship is and learning about it. Again, sort of teaching kids the coolness of the Federation when Rock Talk and Jim Pog go in and get the replicator, and they get to replicate food was super cool. And Jake and Pog just ordering this like big mess of a thing. But the heartbreaking moment was Rock Talk just doesn't know any other can't imagine anything else other than the slop that she was fed. I think that was actually very heartbreaking. And I want to keep mentioning this because it's interesting to me. There's actually some subtle kind of really salient social and political points being made here in a kid's show that I really was appreciating. Like, we have the diviner who's using these divide and conquer tactics, like workers not being able to talk with each other, which was an actual like tactic used by different workers trying to break up like unions and things like that, where people just wouldn't be able to talk to each other. We have like being distrustful of authority with Doll. We have Rock Talk not being able to like understand a life and imagine a life beyond what she's had so far because she's just grown up in it. I think all of that just reads very true to life and just is a very salient, like interesting point. And I think there's some really depthful like understanding of the nuances of like politics and workers and things like that. I don't want to get full on like socialist communist stuff into here for with you necessarily for a kids show, but I'm just saying that I think there's really a deep understanding of these dynamics that these showrunners are showcasing here, and I thought that scene with Rock Talk was absolutely a wonderful way to evoke that. I also like the other small scenes where we get to see like the crew quarters, and I like they're all going to be sleeping together in bunk beds. Very Lower Decksian feel to me, but I do get that it's going to be a way for them to all like combine together instead of getting their own separate quarters. That was all really fun. Murph being adorable, jumping around was cool to see. We also had the Diviner and Deadlock here. We got to see a lot more of the Diviner. Like we got to see his full face instead of him being dark and in shadows as he was in the premiere. Not much to say about him other than like he has this big world ship that looks pretty evil and pretty badass that has this cool cloaking system. It's interesting to me that he's very much after the Protostar when he clearly has a lot of technology already at his disposal. So I'm very curious to see what the Protostar has for him other than like obviously this interesting drive that Jake and Pog found that he's not entirely sure about. So it must be something to do with propulsion and things like that. Also, this might be a future spoiler. I do not know going forward, but I've heard from a friend of mine, Aaron Harvey, who I do the Drawn to Trek podcast with. He had a great theory that the Protostar is actually from the future and that time travel is involved. Just based on some small things, like for example, this series takes place only a few years after Voyager returned to the Delta Quadrant, and also the Diviner himself said he'd been looking for the Protostar for quote unquote years now. And so it wouldn't make much sense that Voyager comes back to the Delta Quadrant. There's this brand new ship with this brand new crazy technology that they've never seen before at this point in Star Trek, even on lower decks. And they also program a Janeway hologram into it. And also they have brand new badges. And then it gets sent back to the Delta Quadrant, I should say, too, just a few years after they get back. And then the Diviner's looking for it for several years. It just doesn't, the timeline doesn't make much sense if it was built like immediately after Voyager got back to the Alpha Quadrant. And so this has me thinking that this ship is actually from the future and landed here. And that's why the Diviner's aware of it and wants it. So that's my kind of theory on it. Again, I'll give credit to Aaron Harvey for that. But it's sort of an interesting idea that I think might play out in future episodes of the season. Also, last little bit to say here is I loved the final sequence with them running into the star. I mean, it was sort of a contrived situation, but it works for me as a kid show because it highlights Doll's sort of arrogance and impatience to just get out there and do his own thing and not really trusting anyone. And then just Janeway's like, I can help you if you want my help. And just the insanity that pursued out of that, and eventually like them really working together under Janeway to be able to pull together and actually get out of the star, and them actually like having hints at an actual competent crew dynamic there. And I love Janeway saying that, like, I see you all have potential. Also, I should say Janeway earlier when she was encouraging Rock Talk was also very sweet, and I enjoyed that. That was a good moment for Hologram Janeway to like flesh out her character and how she cares about these kids so far. So that was a nice little sweet moment. But the fight sequence too with Rock Talk and Gwen was also wonderful. The building up of the shuttle, which, as I joked about before, this might explain why Voyager had so many shuttles. Obviously they weren't making shuttles, but I like this idea that they can like basically 3D print a shuttle at any point, which will be an interesting thing going forward. But that sequence was also really cool, like where they're fighting as the shuttle was being built around them. It was just a cool dynamic sequence that I've never really seen before in Star Trek that I really, really enjoyed. I thought that was very cool. And also one last thing, speaking of Rock Talk that I forgot to mention, is I liked seeing this dynamic that everyone thinks that Rock Talk is the muscle, ready to beat people up just because she's big and strong. And you can clearly see that makes her kind of uncomfortable that she's seen that way. And as someone myself who, like, you know, as a trans person, to use that phrase, overuse that phrase, but there's this idea that someone would be judged and like put into a box just based on their physical bodies, something that rings very real to me, that she would just be judged as like, I'm gonna beat people up person, when that's not really who she is. I thought that was just a cool little hinting at that there, and I'm sure that'll be something going forward that she's going to push back against and speak up for. So I thought that was a little cool hinting at that going forward. But that's everything that I have for this episode. So a lot of cool stuff in this. I'm really enjoying the show so far. Again, I will say this episode didn't knock my socks off. There was nothing here that was like, oh, that's like so unique and amazing, outside of like the shuttle building sequence here. But I think this is very much laying the groundwork for some really good character dynamics mechanics and storytelling going forward. So this did everything that it had to do in terms of laying the groundwork for what the show is, and I'm excited to continue watching Prodigy going forward because it's impressing me so far. But I'd love to hear all of your thoughts down in the comments below. Did you like this episode? Did you dislike this episode? I'd love to hear all of that. But beyond all of that, don't forget to subscribe. I have a Patreon. I have a main channel where I do video essay stuff. But beyond all of that, I just thank you for being here. Thank you for being here, and I hope that you, as always, live long and prosper.